Wyoming Territory, September 1878. The wind blew dry across the sagebrush flats as the train hissed to a stop in the dusty outpost of Rawlins Station, its iron belly groaning low like something wounded. Eleanor Parkman stepped down from the railcar with one hand pressed to the rounded curve of her belly and the other gripping the worn strap of her carpetbag. Her boots hit the platform with a soft thud, and everything inside her stilled. She scanned the crowd, heart pounding. He was not there. Not her husband, not the man who had written weeks ago promising to meet her. Not the man she had married by proxy back in Missouri, who was supposed to build a home with her on a parcel of land he claimed to own just north of the Medicine Bow Range. Eleanor looked again, harder this time, but no one stepped forward. Men in heavy coats and dust-covered hats strode past her, and women with children hurried toward wagons. The wind caught her shawl. She held it tighter. A mile away, a hawk circled high above the plains. "You looking for someone?" asked a stationman with a crooked badge pinned to his vest. "My husband, Walter Parkman. He said he would be here," she said, voice catching. The man looked her over. His mouth pressed into a line when he saw her stomach. "You his wife?" "Yes," he nodded toward the freight office. "There's a letter came in last week, might be for you." Inside, the freight clerk handed her a folded note with her name scrawled in a hurried hand. She opened it slowly. The words were few. "I changed my mind. I cannot take care of you or a child. Do not come looking. W.P." Her knees went weak. She sat down hard on a crate, the note falling from her fingers. "I am sorry, ma'am," the clerk said, not unkindly. "Ain't the first time something like this happened here." Eleanor blinked fast, forcing the tears back. She would not fall apart here, not in front of these men, not when she still had a life growing inside her. She left the office, walking out into the bright sun. She passed the depot, still clutching her bag, and found a bench near the edge of the platform. She sat and stared out toward the open land, endless and unfamiliar. She had nowhere to go, no money for a return trip, no kin west of the Mississippi. She was completely, utterly alone. The muffled sound of hoofbeats came from beyond the station fence. A rider emerged from the line of cottonwoods edging the hills. He moved with quiet purpose, tall, broad-shouldered, sitting straight in the saddle. His horse was lean and dark. He wore no uniform, no badge. Only a bone-handled knife at his hip and a rifle tied behind his saddle. He paused not far off, eyes scanning the platform. Eleanor noticed him when he glanced her way and did not look away. Their eyes met. He nudged his horse forward, stopping a few feet from the bench. His expression was unreadable but not unkind. His long black hair was tied back and his skin was sun-darkened, his face sharp and still. "An Apache." "You are alone," he said simply, voice low and even. Eleanor hesitated. "Yes." He looked at her belly, then back to her face. "No one came?" She shook her head. He looked toward the train, then toward the hills. "This place is not safe for a woman with no one," she swallowed. "I do not have anywhere else." He dismounted slowly, the way someone does when they do not want to frighten a skittish animal. "I am called Jalen Tahoma, Eleanor Parkman. You should not stay here, I know, but I do not know where to go." Jalen studied her a long moment, then he said, "Come with me." Her eyes widened. "Where? Home? I do not know you," he nodded. "I know." "You can still choose." She looked down at her hands, then out at the land again. It stretched in all directions. No fences, no shelter, no familiar faces. She looked up at him again, his eyes steady and calm. "I do not have much of a choice, do I?" "You do," he said. "But this is one way." Eleanor stood slowly. Her back ached. The baby kicked once, as if reminding her time was short. She met Jalen's gaze. "All right." He took her bag without asking and tied it behind his saddle. Then he helped her up onto the horse, placing her in front of him with care. His hands were strong and warm. As they rode away from the station, heads turned. A few men muttered under their breath. One even spat. But Jalen did not look at them. His focus stayed ahead, guiding the horse into the foothills. They rode in silence for a time, the sun beginning to dip behind the hills. The air turned cooler. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her body aching. She felt his arm steady her when the horse stumbled on a rock. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Yes, but I will be fine." He did not press. The trail narrowed, and they followed it into a grove of pine where the air smelled of sap and smoke. After another hour, they reached a small hollow nestled between two ridges. A cabin stood there, made of timber and stone. Smoke rose from the chimney. A corral stood off to the side, a few goats milling near the fence. Jalen helped her down gently. "This is my place." She stepped forward, her legs stiff. "You live alone?" He nodded. "Since my brother died last year, I am sorry." He opened the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A fire crackled in the hearth. A cot stood near the back, and a table with two chairs sat beside the window. There was a woven rug on the floor. A wooden cradle stood near the fireplace, emptied of use but still cared for. She noticed the cradle and looked at him. He said nothing. "I will not be a burden," she said softly. "You are not," Jalen replied. That night she sat near the fire while he cooked beans and cornbread. When he handed her a plate, she took it with a quiet thank you. They ate without much talk, just the sound of the fire and the wind outside. Later, when she began to drift off in the chair, Jalen laid a blanket over her shoulders. "You should sleep in the cot," he said, "and you?" "I will take the floor." "No, let me sleep here." "I will not let you sleep sitting up, not in your condition." She looked into his eyes. Again, that steady calm, no demand, just quiet care. "All right," she whispered. He helped her into the cot and pulled the blanket over her. She watched him settle near the hearth, using a folded blanket as a pillow. As she lay there, her hand resting on her belly, she stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how she had ended up here in a stranger's home, in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness, carrying a child whose father had walked away. And yet, she felt safer than she had in weeks. She turned her head, watching the firelight flicker across Jalen's profile. The shadows played along the lines of his face, his eyes half-lidded but awake. He was still watching the flames, still listening to the night. "Thank you," she said softly. He did not move. But after a moment he replied, "You are welcome." And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor slept without fear. By early morning, the fire had sunk to embers and the wind outside had shifted, carrying the scent of damp pine. Eleanor woke slowly, her body sore but rested. Through the small window, the sky had just begun to pale with dawn. She pushed the blanket aside and sat up carefully, one hand braced behind her. The wooden cot creaked beneath her, but she made no sound. Jalen was gone from where he'd lain near the hearth. His folded blanket had been neatly set aside, and the door stood slightly ajar. She heard the distant sound of hooves and a low whistle, steady and even. She pulled on her boots, laced the shawl over her shoulders, and stepped outside. The morning was cold enough to sting. Mist clung to the low hollows and frost silvered the tall grass. Jalen stood near the corral, a pail in one hand, brushing down the horse from yesterday. He didn't look up as she approached but said, "You found rest." "I did," he nodded once. "You're steady on your feet, for now." "The baby shifts a lot in the morning, makes me feel off balance." He set the pail down and gestured toward the cabin. "There's broth warming. I'll bring in more wood soon. Let me help. You need food first, then you can sweep the hearth if you like." "Fire's been drawing a little slow." She glanced toward the cabin, then back at him. "You built it yourself, with my brother, before snow came 3 winters ago." She didn't ask what had taken him. It didn't feel like a question he would answer, and she wasn't ready to carry another sorrow yet. Instead, she turned back inside and found the kettle hanging low over the coals, faint steam curling from its spout. She poured a ladle into a tin cup and sat at the table, sipping slowly. A narrow shelf above the hearth held a small bundle of dried sage and a carved stone bowl. 3 lengths of beaded leather hung from nails beside the door, each stitched with different patterns. One was missing a few strands, the thread frayed. She didn't reach for them. Outside, the sound of chopping began sharp, rhythmic strikes that echoed against the trees. She had just finished her drink when the door opened again. Jalen stepped in, bringing with him the scent of bark and cold air. He carried an armful of wood and set it down near the hearth. "I'll fetch water from the creek," he said, brushing wood chips from his sleeves. Let me come, he paused, then gave a small nod. Bring the tin pail, it's by the bench. The creek wasn't far, just beyond a rise where the trees grew thicker and the ground dipped. The walk was slow, and Eleanor held her belly as the weight shifted with each step. Jalen didn't rush her. He walked just ahead, steady and quiet. When they reached the water, she knelt carefully and dipped the pail. The cold stung her fingers, but she didn't flinch. You knew I was alone, she said, watching the water swirl. Back at the station. How? I saw the letter fall from your hand. She looked up. You read it. I saw enough. She stood, the pail sloshing full. I was a fool to believe he'd meet me. You believed a promise, that's different. They walked back without speaking. At the cabin, she set the pail inside and turned to face him. I don't know what you want from this, she said. From me. I didn't bring you here to take anything. Then why? He met her eyes, and something in his expression shifted just slightly, like a shadow slipping across stone. Some things deserve a chance to live, you and the child among them. She didn't answer. Didn't know how to, not yet, but she didn't look away. That afternoon, she swept the hearth and folded the spare blankets, hands busy even while her thoughts wandered. She found a rhythm in the work and noticed how each thing in the cabin had its place. The way the kindling was stacked, the careful stitching on the cradle's quilt, the smooth polish on the wooden spoons. Near supper, Jalen returned from the ridge with a brace of rabbits. He cleaned them silently, his hands practiced and sure. Eleanor peeled potatoes without being asked. They ate beside the fire again, though tonight she sat on a wool pad he laid out for her on the floor near the warmth. After the meal, she leaned back against the hearth and watched the flames. I taught school in Missouri, she said. Before I married, I liked it. The quiet hours, the way children look when they understand something for the first time. Jalen nodded slowly. I wanted to learn how to read when I was a boy. My grandfather said stories were for those who remembered. He didn't need paper. My father didn't think women should teach, but he took sick, and the church paid me to keep the school going. I think I would have kept at it if things had turned out different. He looked at her, and this time his voice held something softer. Things can still turn. She folded her hands over her belly. The baby was still now, as if listening. I don't know what kind of mother I'll be, she said. You'll find it in the doing, like anything. The fire cracked and the room filled with its warmth. She tilted her head toward him. You speak like someone who's lost more than a brother. His jaw shifted, but he didn't look away. I've seen good people taken by things that don't make sense. Fire, fever, men with no honor. She leaned back further, eyes half closed. I don't expect you to carry my trouble. I don't carry what's not given. The silence that followed was long but not heavy. When he finally stood, he took her empty cup and rinsed it at the basin. She watched his movements, the way he treated each task with quiet care. Do you want me to stay only until the child comes? She asked. He didn't turn. I didn't put a limit on it. I just need to know where I stand. He dried the cup and set it down. You stand where you choose to. She didn't ask anything else. That night, she lay in the cot again, the blanket pulled to her chin. The cradle beside the hearth remained untouched, but she found her eyes drifting to it as the firelight danced. Jalen sat near the window, sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes, the sound soft and steady against the whetstone. She didn't speak. But when she drifted to sleep, it was knowing she was not waiting anymore for a man who had never meant to keep her. She was here now, in this place carved from silence and pine, beside a man who said little but meant what he said. And for the first time, she felt the shape of something beginning. Not hope, not yet, but the ground where it might take root. The first snow came early that year. It fell silent and heavy, blanketing the roof and softening the edges of the hills. Jalen had seen the clouds stacking low across the western rim since dawn, and by mid-afternoon, the trees stood draped in white. The goats huddled close to their shelter, and the air had the stillness of a land holding its breath. Inside, Eleanor sat at the table, her feet resting on a folded rug as she slowly stitched a seam along a small cotton gown. The fire warmed the side of her face, and now and then she paused to stretch her fingers. Her belly had dropped in recent days and her breath came easier, though her steps had slowed. Jalen set a haunch of venison to roast on the spit, his movements spare. When he turned, he noticed her watching him. "Will the snow trap us here?" she asked. He shook his head. "For a while, but I have enough stores for the winter." "And if the baby comes before the thaw," he dried his hands on a cloth. "Then it comes here. And if something goes wrong," he sat across from her. "My mother birthed 7 children in one-room cabins. My aunt knew how to turn a breech with her bare hands. I watched her do it. If I need to, I remember what she did." Eleanor pressed the needle through the fabric again, slower this time. "You don't seem afraid." "I've lived through worse things than a birth." She didn't respond right away. The wind caught against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters once before dying down again. When she finally spoke, her voice had softened. "I dreamed last night I was back in St. Joseph. But the streets were empty and the church bells wouldn't stop ringing. I kept running between buildings, but no one would open their doors." Jalen leaned back slightly. "Dreams don't always lie, but they don't always tell the whole thing either." She set the sewing aside. "You ever dream of your brother?" He nodded once. "What do you see?" "He's out past the ridge starting a fire, and he keeps waiting for someone to join him, but I can't cross the distance." She didn't ask more. The fire popped and the scent of roasting meat filled the room. After they ate, she gathered the scraps from the table and fed them to the chickens in the coop beside the shed. Snow clung to her skirts and her breath came in little clouds. Jalen watched from the porch, arms folded, not offering to take the task from her. When she came back inside, she eased into the chair by the hearth, brushing frost from her sleeves. "You ever married?" she asked. "No, why not? Never met someone who made me want to stay." She glanced at the cradle, then back at him. And now, he didn't look away. "I'm still here." She folded her hands over her middle. "I never thought I'd end up in a stranger's home, sewing clothes for a baby whose name I haven't even chosen yet. Names come when they're ready. You think so?" "I do." She studied him a moment. "What does Jalen mean?" "It means calm waters." "That doesn't suit you." He lifted a brow. "You're not calm, not really. You hold things quiet, but not calm. There's a difference." He didn't answer, but his gaze stayed on her. She leaned forward, adjusting the hem of her dress. "I was going to name the baby Anna if it was a girl, after my mother, but now that name feels like it belongs to another life." Jalen stood and added a log to the fire. "Then choose one for this life." She didn't reply, but her eyes stayed on the flames. Later, when the snow fell heavier and the wind howled through the trees, Jalen took down a woven pouch from the rafters. He laid the contents out on the table: dried yarrow willow bark, a small jar of bear fat. Eleanor watched as he moved with quiet care, measuring and sorting. "What's all that for?" "Pain, fever, bleeding. I keep it in case. You know how to use it." "I learned from an old woman who lived near the Gila. She saved my cousin after a fall." She stepped closer. "You've seen a lot of hurt. I've seen enough to learn how to meet it." She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of a folded cloth beside the herbs. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" He looked up. "I don't believe in halfway." She let her hand rest on the table near his. "I don't either, not anymore." He didn't move, but something in his posture shifted just slightly, like the tension easing from a drawn bow. That night, as wind swept along the eaves, Eleanor stood by the window, watching snow drift against the glass. Jalen sat near the hearth, the fire casting low light across his face. She didn't speak, not right away. The quiet between them had changed, no longer empty but full of something forming. When she finally turned away from the window and faced him, her voice was low. "If I stay here, it won't be just until spring." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I know." She crossed the room slowly, her feet bare against the rug. She stopped beside his chair and rested her hand on the windowsill behind him. "I won't be someone who waits to be told where she belongs. You haven't been." "I'll need more than shelter." He looked up at her. "You'll have more than that." She nodded once. Then she reached for his shoulder, her touch light but certain. He rose and they stood there, close but not yet touching beyond what was needed. "I don't want promises," she said. "I don't give them." She met his gaze, steady and sure now. "Then we're even." The fire crackled once and the wind outside began to quiet. The storm was passing. He reached for her hand and she let him. Not as a gesture, not as comfort, but as a beginning. The thaw came slow, seeping into the seams of the land in careful increments. Snow retreated from the southern slope first, leaving behind damp earth and bent grasses. The air turned soft in the afternoons, carrying the scent of warming pine and wet bark. Ice broke loose from the edges of the creek, and birds returned, their calls cutting through the stillness like threads sewing the season open. Eleanor stood behind the cabin with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hanging damp linens over a length of hemp cord Jalen had strung between two posts. Her hands worked with steady purpose, the clothespins clacking softly as she fastened each garment. The weight across her back had grown heavier, and she moved carefully, the child within her restless now at odd hours. But she moved without discomfort, and there was calm in the steadiness of her routine. Jalen approached from the ridge, leading a bay mare with a single white sock. Her ribs showed faintly, but her gait was clean. He slowed as he reached the cabin, letting the reins slacken. "She wandered down from higher ground," he said. "No brand, no shoe, might have broken loose from a wagon team." Eleanor stepped closer, eyeing the animal with quiet interest. "She doesn't look wild. She's not. She took grain from my hand. What'll you do with her? Keep her through spring, see if she'll carry saddle again." She ran a hand along the mare's shoulder, fingers trailing through the dust-matted coat. "She's got a calm eye. Reminds me of someone." She turned, a small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "You mean me?" "I meant the goat," he said, straight-faced. She laughed, the sound sudden and light, and it caught both of them off guard. He tilted his head slightly, watching her, but said nothing else. That evening, the wind died off early and they sat outside on the porch, a blanket draped across Eleanor's lap. The sun dipped low behind the far ridge, casting long shadows across the scrub. Jalen whittled a sliver of juniper, the shavings curling into his palm. Eleanor watched the horizon, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. "Does your family know you're here?" she asked. "They did," he said, not looking up from the blade. "Before they passed, all of them?" He nodded once. "I'm sorry." He set the carving aside carefully. "You don't need to be. Still," she said quietly. "I think there's something sacred in being remembered." He leaned back against the porch post, gaze fixed on the tree line. "My grandfather used to say the dead don't need our sorrow. They need our firewood stacked and our children fed." She looked down at her hands, then over at him. "You ever think about leaving this place?" "I did once. Thought about joining the railroad camps down near Santa Fe. But I stayed." "What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a long time. "Then I saw a child left behind when a fever took a mother. She was no older than 3. No one stopped, not one wagon. I carried her as far as I could, but she didn't make it." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the blanket. "I buried her just east of here," he said. "That was the day I stopped thinking about going anywhere else." She didn't speak again until the stars began to show above the trees. When she did, her voice was soft but sure. "If it's a girl, I'll name her Ruth." Jalen turned to her. "Why that name?" "Because it means companion, and because she'll never be left behind." He nodded once, approval in the gesture, and then stood to gather the last of the firewood. Inside, the cabin held its heat well. Eleanor moved slowly as she folded the last of the baby clothes into the small cedar chest Jalen had carved for her. She ran her hand over the lid, tracing the smooth wood where he'd etched a simple shape of a pine tree with a single star above it. He came in just as she finished, his face ruddy from the wind. "I'll be riding south tomorrow," he said. "There's a trader who owes me salt and flour. I'll be back by dusk." She nodded once, then added, "I'll be fine here. I've already boiled water." Laid out the clean cloths. "You think it's time?" "Soon, but not tomorrow." She met his gaze. "I'll know when it is." He looked at her a long moment. "If something changes, I won't wait. I'll do what I have to." He stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the cradle. "You've already done more than most would." She reached up, her fingers brushing his wrist. "So have you," he didn't pull away. "I never said thank you," she said. "You don't need to." "I do," she answered, "because what you gave me wasn't just shelter. It was the space to become someone else." He closed his hand over hers. "Not someone else, just more of who you already were." A silence settled between them again, but it held no weight. It felt instead like the slow bend in a river before it opens wide. That night when she lay down, she felt the child shift low, the movement deeper than before. Her body answered with a quiet ache, not painful, just alert. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the blankets wrap around her, steady as the man who slept only a few feet away, his breath even, his presence a promise that needed no words. The child came 2 days after the mare foaled in the paddock, the night still with the hush of late spring and the smell of wet cedar rising from the trees. Eleanor woke to a slow, pulling ache and the unmistakable rhythm building low in her body. She sat up carefully, pressing one hand to her belly, the other to the cot frame. The fire had burned down to its coals. Jalen lay on the floor beside the hearth, his breath even. She didn't call out. Instead, she stood as carefully as she could and crossed the room to the table, where she had laid out cloths, water basin, and a small tin of salve 3 days earlier. Her breath caught on the next wave of pain, stronger than the last, and she leaned forward, bracing herself against the edge of the table. Jalen stirred. She heard the shift of his weight as he rose. "Eleanor, it's starting," she said. "But it's early yet." He stepped over and helped her sit, his hands steady beneath her arms. "I'll warm more water," he said. She nodded, teeth clenched, and waited for the next wave to pass. It came, steady and sure, and she leaned into it without fear. Hours passed without measure. The sun rose behind thin clouds, flooding the cabin with a soft gray light. Jalen moved without speaking unless she asked. He kept the fire steady, brought her water, held her hand when the pain crested too sharp to breathe through alone. When at last the child came, it was with a low cry and a rush of relief so deep Eleanor wept without sound, her face pressed to the crook of her arm. "It's a girl," Jalen said, his voice thick with something she hadn't heard before. He wrapped the child in a soft cloth she had stitched weeks earlier and placed her gently in Eleanor's arms. Eleanor looked down at the tiny face, the mouth open in a searching yawn, the eyes dark and unfocused. "Ruth," she whispered, and her chest ached with the weight of it. Jalen knelt beside her. He did not reach, not yet, but he looked at the child with a reverence that needed no words. "She's strong," he said. "She has to be." They stayed like that for a long while, the fire warm, the wind outside calm. When Ruth began to doze against her chest, Eleanor looked over at Jalen. "You're not just someone I met at a station," she said. "You know that, don't you?" "I know. I've watched the way you carry sorrow without making it anyone else's burden. The way you never take more than you give." He met her gaze. "I don't know what comes next, Eleanor, but I won't go back to being alone. You won't have to." He reached then, gently, and touched Ruth's tiny hand. Her fingers curled instinctively around his thumb. "I want us to build something," she said. "Not just stay alive, I want a life, a good one." "We'll make it with what we have," he said. "And what we need, we'll build." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You've been patient with me. You needed time to become ready." "I would have waited longer." "Good thing you didn't have to," she whispered, smiling. By the next week, the trees had leafed out and the goats wandered farther from the fence line. Jalen added a second shelf to the wall above the hearth, where Eleanor placed the first of the books she'd brought in her carpet bag, kept all this time beneath the cot. Unread but never forgotten, Ruth grew quickly. Her cries were strong, her grip tighter each day. Jalen made her a cradle board from ash and soft leather, and Eleanor lined it with the last of the Missouri cotton she'd carried since the train. They hung it near the window where the sun warmed the floor each morning. Eleanor taught Jalen to read from the Bible, starting with Genesis, though they both agreed the Psalms held the better poetry. He picked up words faster than she expected, and after a month, he was reading aloud to Ruth in the evenings while Eleanor sewed small clothes by lamplight. They never spoke of Missouri again. One warm day in June, Jalen led Eleanor and Ruth to the rise just west of the cabin, where the pines opened to a wide view of the valley. Below them, the creek shimmered in the sun and the grass moved in long, slow waves. He turned to her, his expression unreadable at first, but then his voice came low and certain. "There's a way my people mark bond between two who choose each other, not through paper, through choice spoken and lived." She looked down at Ruth, sleeping against her chest, then back at him. "Tell me how." He took her hand, thumb brushing the base of her fingers. "We speak our promise aloud and we walk forward 3 steps together. One for the past, one for the present, one for what we make beyond this day." She nodded, her hand tightening in his. They stepped forward. Once for what they'd lost, twice for the home they'd made, a third time for everything ahead. When they stopped, Eleanor turned to him. "I choose you," she said. He answered without pause, "And I you." That night they lay together beneath the open window, Ruth sleeping in the cradle beside them. The air smelled of wildflowers and warm wood. Jalen's hand rested over Eleanor's, their fingers laced, no more leaving, no more waiting. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of a life beginning together.